And this is what really, this is the most interesting part of this presentation to me. I've given this same exact talk to live audiences probably like half a dozen times now. As a matter of fact, if you're in Beaumont or Katy, Texas, here in like the next week, I'm going to be over there talking about some of the same stuff. These are mostly political groups that I talk to here in Texas. And it is always a real wake up call for them because the historical trends are undeniable. Someone told me on Twitter the other day, you can argue with a lot of things, but you can't argue with history. And I think in this case, it's true. So this is what really concerns me. What I'm about to share with you is, if this makes me uneasy, it kind of keeps me up at night. But if you were to ask me why I push intelligence so much, it's not really for tornadoes or hurricanes. Actually, it's not for short-term emergencies at all. We can get to that, no problem. No concerns about that whatsoever. What keeps me up at night is the potential for a protracted multi-year domestic conflict or some similar catastrophe. And I think it's important for you to know this. I'm sharing it with you because it puts all this intelligence stuff into context. I think we are on track for maybe a color revolution, or maybe something like the Irish Troubles or the Argentine Dirty Civil War, maybe something worse than the 2020 Summer of Love. And I think that's probably going to start back up before the 2028 elections. I don't think it's going to happen immediately. I know there have been a lot of predictions on that. I track the far left for a living. I don't see it happening immediately, but they're trying to build that sense of urgency back up. You go back to the 2020 Summer of Love. That took 4 years to build. That movement took 4 years of daily agitation to build. And we're starting to see that daily agitation now. And it's just not something I think that can be unleashed in a matter of definitely not days, definitely not weeks, probably not months. We'll see. And listen, I'm all in on Trump, by the way. I wish him the best. It's been a great couple of weeks. I'm not tired of winning yet, but we are in the honeymoon phase. And there is a long road ahead of us, and we should just be very realistic about that. So I'm sure most of you by now have heard about or read this book, maybe The Fourth Turning. It was published back in the late 1990s, the first book. And it's about generational cycles and their conclusion. They're demographers, so they study demographics, people. And their conclusion was that the fourth turning in the cycle is always the conflict generation cycle. Now, I have my own little problems with this book, but it is an interesting theory, and I think they're probably right. The original prediction was that by 2005, this fourth turning, this conflict generation in the cycle would be triggered by austerity or a terror attack, a government shutdown, a new pandemic, or war with Russia. And they were about 15 years early on most of that stuff, but otherwise not too bad. For this being written in the late 1990s, I thought they did actually a pretty good job of the last chapter scoping out possibilities in the future. Now, a couple of years ago, Neil Howe wrote an update to the book, and this one's called The Fourth Turning is Here. And he said the fourth turning should peak around 2030 and be resolved somewhere between 2034 and 2038. Some people call this kook science. He's a demographer. This is just what he says. I take it as a data point. It's not written in stone for me. But another thing I want to tell you is that he was actually pretty dark about this. He said that low-level violence and peaceful secession were unlikely. Remember, he was writing this kind of like in the heyday of this national divorce movement, right? We want a peaceful national divorce. This is what these people said. He said he thinks that's unlikely. And he thinks the most likely scenario is organized political violence. So we're playing team sports against each other. He thinks this is going to be an actual war. Not like 1861. War can take a lot of different forms, but he is not very optimistic about this being like, 2017 to 2020. He thinks it's going to be far worse. And that's just what he thinks. Now, I do a lot of research into this stuff. I find the history of collapse, and especially domestic conflicts and revolutions, it's all just extremely fascinating to me. So I spend a lot of my free time reading through these books and historical studies. And so many years ago, I came across Sir John Glubb, actually an acquaintance of mine recommended this book to me and I started reading it and I was like, holy cow, who is this guy? This is wild. So he wrote this book back in the 1970s. Sir John Glubb was a British intelligence officer and he studied empires. And what he found is that empires on average last about 250 years. And I'm not going to argue with all of the dates here, but I think his conclusion is generally accurate. Empires last about 10 generations or 250 years. So if you start the clock in the American Empire in 1776 and you add 250 years, you get 2026. I don't think the American Empire actually started, probably not until 1783. That was the end of the American Revolution. That was the Treaty of Paris, which unlocked the Trans-Appalachia region for American settlement. I think that is the real date of the start of the American Empire. So you add 250 years to that and you get 2033. There's also an Estonian political scientist named Rein Taagepera. He did an independent study of about 36 empires and even, about like 32, 34, 36, somewhere in there. And he found that empires lasted about 265 years from birth to peak to collapse. And I remember reading that study and I said, that's very close to Glubb's 250 years. So Taagepera would put the end of if his theory is correct, that would put the end of the American Empire somewhere around 2041. And then also back in the mid 2000s, JP Morgan did a 600-year study of world reserve currencies. Currencies last as the world reserve on average between 80 to 100 years. So we go back to Bretton Woods in 1944. You add 80 years, you get 2024. You add 100 years, you get 2044. And so as I'm doing this research, I started writing down these dates and I said, hey, this is somewhat interesting to me because we look at all these dates here and I doubt this is all a coincidence. Again, I'm an intelligence analyst by trade. I don't look at any one thing as a slam dunk. I wouldn't even say this is a slam dunk. But when I see this many data points all in the same ballpark from different sources across different periods and different cultures, it is very concerning to me, especially in the backdrop of what we have been seeing in this country for the past roughly decade. Also, Ray Dalio, who is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, it's a hedge fund. For decades, it was the world's largest and most successful hedge fund. He wrote a book several years ago called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. He also studied world orders and empires throughout history. And keep in mind also, this guy's a billionaire and he made his money by using other people's money to essentially make bets in the markets. And he was very good at making big bets with other people's money. I don't think you last very long as a hedge fund manager if you're just like very bad at that job. So coming from him, this is also concerning to me. And this is the cycle he describes in this book. And sorry if you can't see it very well. Let me see if this is better. Yeah, maybe a little bit better. So this is the cycle, this thing right here. This is what he describes in the book. His big conclusion is that the U.S.-led world order, the rules-based international order, is coming to a close. And he outlines all these reasons why he thinks that. One of the most important findings in this book is that so many of these world orders have followed this rise, peak, decline cycle. And he said every world order thus far has ended in a debt bust, which happens at the very tip top, the zenith of this world order. And these countries or these empires, they start off with this long period of growth and prosperity, and they start accruing too much debt. And eventually, this debt becomes so burdensome that there's a debt bust, which is followed by money printing and expansion of credit. That's followed by revolutions and wars. By the way, according to Dalio, we have not seen the worst of money printing yet, which is really almost hard to believe because with $36 trillion in debt and counting, it's obvious, though, that we are going to see a lot more money printing ahead because this is what happens. These governments have to print money to pay off their debts. You also get credit expansion during these periods as well. You get massive inflation. We know this is what the Fed's going to have to do. They're going to have to inflate their way out of this problem. So this is not too difficult for me to believe. And then this is followed by revolutions and wars and then political restructuring. So we're talking about the formation of new states or new countries, new governments. And then finally, a new world order begins under somebody else. So it is not unrealistic to expect this to happen over the next 10 or 15 years. I don't think that's a stretch. That's not a stretch for me to believe. And it could happen sooner. You cannot get to this level of extremes and not have a resolution that is also in the extreme. So what we have to understand is that everybody gets wiped out during these events. So I look at this and I'm in the second, this is going to happen in the second half of my life. So this is what we're looking at. This is what I have to look forward to. A lot of us. And my natural questions are, what does this actually end up looking like? How do I escape it? How can I set my kids up and really the next generation up for success? So we've been at this for about an hour now. And I just want to ask you, do you think intelligence, given what we just covered, do you think intelligence should play a role in securing your future? Because in our brief time tonight, I've given you a map. I've explained the importance of intelligence. I've explained what I call my area intelligence system. We've gone through the area study, this basic bare bones area study. We've gone through intelligence networks, how to get that started, real-time collection. And so you have the strategy and the basic tools to get started here. If I had something that could help you build a better area study faster, build a better intelligence network faster, and build better collection skills faster, my question to you is, would you be interested in hearing about it? If there were a place for my research covering the history of low intensity conflicts, national crises, domestic conflicts, civil wars, revolutions, collapse scenarios, if there was a place where I would put all that information so that you can learn from history and be better prepared for the future, would you be interested in hearing that? Because the way forward on this slide right here, regardless of what happens, is building political, social, and economic power. We build political power to make sure that we live under the laws that we want to live under. We build social power to protect our culture and keep the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. And we build economic power because money solves a lot of problems. Money is stored power.